Hey, welcome to the show, homies. It's the wrapping up into summer. Time for another road trip episode. I hear all the time from homies that they binge this podcast when they're on the road trip. So for Labor Day weekend, I'm going to give you a binge playlist. With 6 years of content, the podcast library answers every question you could ever have. So this is your cheat code to home buying clarity. Save this episode to build your personal education collection. Play the music.
How to Buy a Home educates, protects, and connects first-time homebuyers to qualified vetted realtors in their area. Whether you're looking for DIY information or step-by-step guidance, How to Buy a Home is the #1 resource for first-time homebuyers.
What is up? How to Buy a Homies, summertime. I'm your host, David Sidoni, still on my never-ending mission to get you the answers you need to break free from your rent trap. And I know, being a first-time homebuyer right now as we go into the fall and the winter of 2025, it's insanely overwhelming because the housing market, it's upside down, it's sideways, it's up and down, both at the same time. It is straight up bananas. My best advice to you is going to sound a lot like a boomer, though once again, I am straight up Gen X, not a boomer here. Gang, it's all about the fundamentals. You can't control the market, the interest rates, the inflation, the tariffs, the gas prices, or if eggs go to $8 a carton. But what you can control is your knowledge, and that education prepares you to take advantage of whatever's coming around the corner. Clarity, that is the mission here. Clarity on the process, clarity on your best strategies, and clarity on how you can make this happen, even though the housing market feels a little impossible right now. So this is your cheat sheet for all 384 episodes of the podcast. So if you're traveling this weekend, you can cherry pick some episodes to help you set up your own personal custom plan, as well as your own personal action steps as we head into the end of the year. Now, if you're brand new to this entire podcast or this process, easy place for you to start is episode 301. There's 10 episodes on the must-know everything you need for Home Buying 101. After that, I recommend episode 350. That gives you the playbook on a program that we call the last lease ever. It's real practical tips and action steps to improve your position as a buyer while you're saving up, working on your debt, and getting ready while you're still renting. Then you can go to episode 365. This is the one that tells you, you know what? Where am I in this process? I don't even know how this works. It's perfect for figuring out exactly where you stand and what you need to focus on next. And then if you want to get really deep into it and you want to get your How to Buy a Home PhD, the best approach is a mix. You stay up to date with the latest episodes as they drop, because that's how you're going to catch the market shifts and the new opportunities. And then in between the new episodes, dig into like the last year's worth of shows. Pick titles that hit with what you want to learn. That's your best way to use the entire library. Now, if you're worried that half of the jargon that you hear in some of these episodes sounds like a foreign language to you, all the real estate vocabulary, don't sweat it. I've got you covered way back in episode 94. That's where you can find 21 full episodes where I break down every first-time homebuyer term and definition from A to Z. It's your real estate dictionary in podcast form. And now here's some other topics that you can explore to get honest, clear information to help crush the confusion and control that overwhelm. First of all, just dropped 382 to 384. That was the crucial and critical change in the housing market. And there's lots of new advantages for first-time home buyers. So if you haven't listened to those, check them out. And if you're wondering, am I ready? How much can I afford? That's episodes 355, talking about rent versus buy. And you can also go back to episodes 322 and 300. If you're looking for the home buying checklist, that's 373, 376, and 377. And if you're trying to figure out, okay, I get it, David, but how do I save money while I'm paying off my debt at the same time? It's a balancing game, and that's all in episode 381. If you're looking for information on loans, buying a home loan in a high mortgage market, that 2025 update is episode 364. And if you're wondering about getting pre-qualified for a loan, you can learn all about that process and most importantly, learn how to get a plan, not just have someone answer your questions, as well as talking to you about down payment assistance programs and other lending myths. That's my interview with a unicorn lender, episode 339 and 340. And when it comes to mortgage planning, figuring out what you need to do, who, What, why, when, how do I do it? That's episode 346. Student loans got you down? Check episode 349 with our credit expert, who's going to talk to you about the new changes in student loans happening in 2025. If you're looking for financial planning, 280 is a good episode. And there's also a complete 7-part series that starts way back at episode 19. If you have questions about home inspections and the process, that's episode 322. Then there are some other rarely discussed but highly effective tips and tools for first-time home buyers in all stages of education to help get you some action steps. That's episode 328. If you're trying to compare and wonder about condos and townhomes versus a single-family home, that's episode 319. And maybe you're comparing new build versus a regular resale. That's episode 279. And right now, there's some crazy math going on where mortgages are higher than your rent payment. And if you want to figure out the calculations on that and what financially works best for you, that's episode 329, as well as a little bit in that 355 I mentioned earlier. If you've never understood completely closing costs, that's episode 348. And then there's 3 episodes that came from my producer, 30 years old, not buying a home, and he's got me in his ear holes 24/7. So if you want to hear his philosophy as a guy who's hearing this every single day, you could check out episode 274. That's the episode where JT explains why right now, even though he's got the best advice in the world, he still can't buy a home. And then episode 342 is really great. It's where he discusses the things that he wished he had done sooner. If you're looking for tips on moving, I have a great interview with, believe it or not, an expert in moving. That's episode 336 and 337. Now, we also have a whole bunch of FAQs, frequently asked questions from renters all over the country I've gathered over the years. They're in episodes 352 through 360, and there's more of them back in episodes 241 through 244. It's a great resource for you to find questions that people have been asking me. There's also a bunch of past episodes, and we're going to make sure we put them in the show notes for you, that are way deep in the podcast catalog and library. That's where I give you detailed information on things like loans and lenders and picking the right lender and getting the best interest rate. There's dozens of episodes on loans to answer your questions. Using your 401k or your retirement for primary home purchase down payments. There's a bunch of episodes on bidding wars. Your credit score, that is covered very thoroughly. Check the show notes. Not to mention, we're going to talk about credit pull myths in some old episodes. There's episodes on down payment assistance, how to ask your parents for money. That's the Thanksgiving episode every year. Episodes on house hacking, internet sites to help you home shop, buying out of state, PMI, and how it's not the devil, buying a rental property before you buy your own primary residence and how sometimes that's not the best idea, as well as some episodes on the Airbnb excitement that now is turning into something that actually you should be a little more cautious on. And also, of course, there's some episodes on a unicorn realtor, what makes them one and why you need one. Now, here on the How to Buy a Home podcast, one of the best things we've got for you are the interviews. The interviews answer questions on every part of the home buying process because we take people who didn't think they could buy a home, reached out, found the right unicorn team, and then we ask them everything that they did along the way. And each buyer has a different story. And each story has different tips, tools, and techniques that you can use. I'm just going to run down the list here. When you hear something that makes sense to you, then I would say pause it, write that down, and then go back and find that one. There are some classics, like 109 is Brian and Diana, great story. 119 is Brianna, who bought a home while she was overseas in Germany. Crazy. And then 161 is Sally, first person in her family ever to buy a home, and interest rates were high, and she still figured out how to do it. And then we've got what I call my sexy story. It's not creepy or weird like that. It's just a really cool, exciting story. Someone who originally bought with us back in 2020. She had a down payment assistance, and she bought a condo for $197. And then in 2024, she sold that and bought her second home. A home that was bigger, better, and what she really wanted, but she used the stepping stone. That's episode 238. Great episode. Then we got my boy Isaiah, whose full mortgage payment was only $100 more than his rent. He used a VA zero down loan, and I think he ended up putting like only $12,000 down to buy a home. The really cool thing about that one is he's got great tips on planning, as well as a $6,000 home buyer credit that you can do. A really cool trick. That's episode 239. And then Deshaun is a great episode. He's the real deal. Broken into 3 different segments about home buying. That's episode 249. And then another classic is back to episode 167, because Christina and Sean's story was so moving, I cried at the end of that episode. And then if you're trying to figure out how to buy a home with not a lot of money saved, there's a whole bunch of episodes about low down payments and low closing costs and still getting the deal done. There was Jacob, who his total for his closing costs and his down payment was only $2,200. That's episode 194. And then you can also listen to Millie and Ben, bought their first home before they were 30 years old, a $435,000 home with only $17,000 down. That's episode 217. Andrew and Melissa have another great story in 228. Gage and Mozella, they were these self-proclaimed not privileged people who did it all on their own. That's episode 232. And then Declan and Bailey, their episode, they were like, dude, we got someplace for 3% down. We thought buying a home was just for rich people only till we found the podcast and learned everything you could do. That's episode 312. More recently, we had Frederick and Brittany, who had no idea that they could get in for a low down payment, and they bought a great home in Dallas, Texas, and that's episode 372. Now, there are some other people that have given us great stories on buying a home in more high cost of living areas, making that rent replacement strategy work for them because the rents are higher there, and they figured out a way to become a homeowner. There was Jacob. He was a listener, was a doctor, bought a place, and that's episode 116. Andrew and Lene, another great story. That's episode 118. Ashley and Alex, they bought in the not so cheap Boston area, episode 128. Nathan and Brian bought in one of the most expensive parts of the entire country, San Francisco, and it took a little convincing, but when they were working together, I'm not sure, or I just don't feel like telling you, one of them had to convince the other one that using their 401k was the only way they could get into the market, and financially it was going to work out for them in the long run. That's episode 135. And then in the crazy market of Washington, D.C., Caitlin and Mason, their episode 253, and Long Island, because ain't nothing cheap in New York. That's Sam and Kristen from episode 321. And what about if you've got to move someplace new, like to a completely other part of the state, or maybe to a new state entirely? There's great episodes and interviews where people tell you their story and how they made it work. They were one of our first people that moved. They moved from California all the way up to the Pacific Northwest. And then episode 120 is Tatiana and Donovan. And the really cool thing is, Tatiana moved from where they were to the Atlanta area because she wanted to become an actress. And guess what? I just saw her in the Superman movie this summer. So dreams are coming true all over for Tatiana. And there's another great episode for a couple that was shopping in Seattle to buy in Tennessee. That's the story of James and Cynthia, episode 235. And James Parker, he bought a home in 7 weeks with a new job in a new area, episode 257. And then Conan, he did the out-of-state buying thing too in episode 333. Lots of good tips there. And what about if you're a younger buyer and you're thinking, I can't do this? We've got 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 21, 22. And here's some episodes for people who bought under 25 years old. Madison from episode 55. Randy from episode 71. Cortland, the 19-year-old I found on TikTok who bought a home when he was 19 years old. That's episode 85. Yadi and Victor, great story. They dreamed about buying a home and found a way at 25 years old. Episode 234. And then recently, we had Ella buying a home right out of college without 2 full years on a job. They still found a way to do it. That's episode 363. And then there are some people that are, let's just say, not under 25. These people are over the average age of a first-time home buyer, which right now is very disappointingly 41 years old. These guys were older than that. We got Pedro at 59. He had a 0 down payment, and he wasn't using a VA loan or a USDA loan. There was a program that he found with his unicorn team at the time he was looking to buy where he could buy for 0 down. So at 59, he finally bought a home, and that's episode 224. And there's also Stephanie from episode 113. Great stories from her, especially about learning how to change her finances and diversify her savings to buy a home. And then recently, in episode 375, great story from Renee and Tom, buying a home after a lifetime of renting. And then there's one of my favorite categories, because I get so excited when I find young people who take it on their own to take responsibility and get some control over their life. These are the episodes of single females who bought a home. Madison from episode 55. Tuesday, that's her name, from episode 104. Stephanie, who I just mentioned, she's from 113. Amber from 163. Joelle from 169. Emily, our therapist, she bought in and interviews in episode 252. Nika, 26 years old, bought in New Jersey, episode 258. Viola, one of my favorite interviews of all time, single mom, wanted to do something to be an example for her daughter, and she bought a home in Queens, New York, and that's episode 265. And then we had Katie, bought in Austin, Texas, 28 years old, episode 285. Melissa, she bought here in Southern California in a crazy high cost of living area, bought with our team, and we tell her story, episode 324. And then there's Ashley. She was a solo female trying to buy a home, got a realtor, didn't work out, fired that realtor, and when she got the right realtor, she bought a home in 3 days. That's episode 347. There's Claudia. Oh, I love Claudia. She's a drama teacher who bought a home by herself, episode 351. And then there was Carrie, who is a single millennial, bought a $400,000 home with just $12,000 for the down payment and closing costs. That's episode 362. And another great one that we did recently was Regina, solo gal in her 40s, moved, didn't think she was going to stay there a long time, and then over a decade later went, okay, I guess I'm staying here, and figured out how to buy a home later than she anticipated. That's episode 369. And then, speaking of single ladies, the single mom Rosie from episode 380. If you haven't heard that one, highly inspirational. Now, if you're one of those people that is over-prepared, you go deep, deep into your research. You know, perhaps some people call you a little bit anal or a little OCD or a little psychotic. Will you stop researching and just make a decision? These are some episodes, interviews from people that will make you feel at home. These are people who love details and spreadsheets. There's Philip from episode 107. There's Jake. He's a structural engineer. So that gives you some great detail. And Jake even has some stories about getting into a deal and realizing he didn't want to finish that one, when to pull out of the deal. Some great information there. That's episode 121. There's Corey from episode 181, another great detailed spreadsheet guy. And then we've got our self-proclaimed over-researcher, Kendall, from episode 187. My favorite part of her interview was once she got everything done, she felt an immediate peace. And then we've got Hawken, who bought with high rates, and he figured out how to use a mortgage interest rate buy down with the help of his unicorn team. That's episode 236. And then we've got Antonio, who talks about speeding up the home buying process by doing the research. Antonio is another self-proclaimed risk-averse individual. That's episode 318. And Elizabeth was a great interview. Someone who was diversifying her portfolio, looking at a relocation of her assets. And that's episode 327. And finally, the king and queen of over-researching, Sergio and Allie, who I originally called Bob and Bobette. And I did a whole episode about them anonymously. And then they bought a home and decided to come on the show. And that's episode 366. You can hear their story. If you're looking for real life stories about people who broke their lease, there's Allison and Ephraim from 152, Jeff and Ciara from 170, and Jonah, who had multiple offers rejected and then bought a dream home and broke the lease because of the safety factor. They needed to be in a better neighborhood. That's episode 263. Now, those are just three. Many of the interviews you listen to, you'll find out that people did the math and figured out that breaking the lease when we were in an appreciating home price market just made more sense for them. And if you want to hear people's stories about buying new build homes, there's Bryant from episode 185. There's Aaron and Devaney from 226. There's Jelly, again, that's her name too. Someone who's navigating high interest rates and scored big builder incentives, got like $10,000 and a 2-1 buy down, and the home appraised $30,000 over the loan that she was getting. A great deal for her. and that was episode 256. And then we had episode 260, Patrick and Alex. This is an incredible story. They didn't want to look at new builds. They didn't want an HOA. No. When they looked at all the single-family homes, finally they went, you know what? Okay, let's see about this. And their unicorn knew somebody, made a quick phone call, and they ended up getting an interest rate at 4.99%, which was too incredible to pass up. And so they went with that deal. Now, I mentioned some of the people, the doctors, and we had a therapist, and we've got all different kinds of professionals who have big student loans. Well, if you want to hear some stories, you can listen to Jeremiah from episode 195, Stephanie, who had $200,000 in student loans from 233. I think Richard was from 186. Not sure about that one. I've mentioned it before, but I think it's 186. And then we've got Emily from episode 252. People talking about how they bought the home with their student loans. It's great to hear the stories so that you hear real stories instead of the myths. And then there's a few more that I like to mention. Episode 82 is an old school episode with Kenneth and Danielle, who bought using a VA loan in a high cost of living area. Another great one is from a gentleman named Quasi, who got a home right out of college. An incredible way to find out how you can get approved for a home loan using that exact same situation. That's episode 129. And then there's Antoine and Shaylee. Their moving day story is hysterical. That one's fun. 173. We also have Weston, who had zero credit. And I think it was like in 7 months, went from a zero credit score to a homeowner. That's episode 182. Again, episode 189, Stephanie and her husband using their VA loan. That's a great one. Episode 330 is Christina. She's a renter who went to homeowner, but she wanted to buy a place that had her business attached. So that was one of those work-live places. Interesting story if that's something you're looking at. And then there was Jessica, who brought multiple different financial aspects into her loan approval. Using a VA loan, but there was some self-employed stuff as well as a military spouse. It was incredible. Episode 335. And then there's Alexander and David. They had a really interesting story about, mold, terrible advice, and really bad realtors leading them down the wrong way until they got it corrected. That's episode 338. And Jessica. Oh my, Jessica. Jessica bought in Portland. Jessica and her partner lived in a van for 7 years. Then they started renting for a little bit, and they were thinking about buying a home because they got robbed. And while they were robbed and beat up and her partner was sitting at home, he started researching buying a house. And now they own a home in Portland. That's episode 343. Okay, gang, that's your cheat sheet. There's got to be something in there that you have questions about. Everything you need to know about buying your home, it's here because we've been doing this since 2019. And we've been interviewing everybody so you could hear the stories of how real people got this done. So scroll through the titles, check the show notes. There's some of those are going to be listed in there. Put together your road trip jam. And if you're blowing it out this weekend for the end of the summer, go big and binge some episodes when you can. You can do this.
Looking for more DIY education or your own personal step-by-step guidance through the home buying journey? Since 2019, How to Buy a Home has been the #1 resource for first-time home buyers. So visit howtobuyaHome.com to get started.